Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I first want to note that this is our first subcommittee hearing of the 112th Congress, and your first as chairman. I want to congratulate you. Although our jurisdiction includes some of the most difficult issues before the Congress, some of which have historically been very contentious, I look forward to working with you in a spirit of comity to give what we both know are strongly and sincerely held views the fair hearing that they deserve. Having chaired this subcommittee for 2 Congresses, and having served as the ranking member, for several Congresses before that, I appreciate what a challenge this subcommittee can be, and I look forward to working with you. Today's hearing concerns what may be the most difficult and divisive issue we will have the opportunity to consider. A woman's right to make decisions about her own body, whether to become pregnant, whether to continue a pregnancy, or whether to terminate it, has long been a right protected by the Constitution. Whether or not people think that is a good idea, or a fair reading of the Constitution, or morally correct, it remains the law of the land. Congress has, for more than 3 decades, used economic coercion to try to prevent women from exercising that constitutionally protected choice by prohibiting use of federal funds for abortions, the only legal health care procedure subject to such a ban. Until now, that coercion was directed against the poor and against women dependent on the government for health care, military personnel and their dependents, prison inmates, and federal employees. We have thus developed a 2-tiered system in which people with means have the right to choose, but members of vulnerable populations do not. Now comes the No Taxpayer Funding for Abortion Act, H.R. 3, which is really misnamed because it has very little to do with taxpayer funding for abortions, but goes way beyond that question and places government in the middle of private choices by families and businesses about how they wish to spend their own health care dollars. This legislation represents an entirely new front in the war against women and their families. After 2 years of hearing my Republican colleagues complain that government should not meddle in the private insurance market or in private health care choices, I was stunned to see legislation so obviously designed to do exactly that. It seems that many Republicans believe in freedom, provided no one uses that freedom in a way they find objectionable. That is a strange understanding of freedom. Even more stunning, this bill contains a huge tax increase on families, businesses, and the self-employed if they spend their own money. Let me repeat that, their own money on insurance that covers abortions or services. The power to tax is the power to destroy, and here the taxing power is being used quite deliberately to destroy the right of every American to make private health care decisions free from government interference. A Republican tax increase, Republican support for government intrusion in private health care choices. I'm supposed to say you heard it here first, but if you read the bill, you saw it there first. I'm equally surprised to find out that my Republican colleagues think that a tax exemption or credit is a form of government funding. What happened to all the rhetoric about it's being our money? Or does that only apply in certain circumstances? Will we now have to call every tax exemption or credit a form of government funding for the recipient? I'm sure there will be many businesses, charities, and religious denominations that will be alarmed to find out that they are receiving government subsidies. I also join many other Americans in being absolutely horrified before I get to that, let me say that among others who should be horrified are all the churches and synagogues and mosques that will now have to presumably give up their tax exemptions, because if tax exemptions are government subsidies, then that's a direct establishment of religion. And the logic is inexorable. Either a tax exemption is government funding, in which case we cannot give tax exemptions to churches and synagogues and mosques, or it is not, in which case this bill has no claim on anything. I also join many other Americans in being absolutely horrified that the sponsors of this bill seem not to know what rape and incest are. Rape, according to this legislation, is only forcible, in quotes, rape. Date rape, drugs, sex with minors, with the mentally impaired are, at least according to the sponsors of this bill, not really rape anymore. Incest also is no longer incest. Instead, it is now only incest with a minor. that we have to be concerned about, which means, I guess, that incest with a high school senior doesn't count. Have the extremes really taken such a hold on this debate that we cannot even agree to help children and teenagers who are the victims of predators? Is there no compassion left in this Capitol? I have heard that the rape and incest provisions are going to be removed from this bill or modified because of the outcry it has raised. They have raised. But first, we have not seen such an amendment yet. And second, what does this provision, even if amended, what does this provision in the first place say about the mindset and intent of the sponsors of the legislation? There's also a provision in this bill that in the name of conscience of healthcare providers would allow any healthcare provider or institution to refuse to provide an abortion to a woman who would die if she doesn't get their abortion. They would be allowed to refuse to provide an abortion in the emergency room even if the medical judgment is that without that abortion she would die. They would let that woman die right there in the emergency room, and the government would be powerless to do anything to penalize that or to prevent it. In fact, if the government, under the provisions of this bill, insisted that the hospital not let the woman die, Section 311 of the bill would allow the hospital to sue the government, and in the case of a state or locality, strip that community of all federal funding until the jurisdiction relented and allowed women to die if they needed an abortion to prevent the death. That's the new definition, it seems, of pro-life. So, Mr. Chairman, let's start off on the right foot. The No Taxpayer Funding of Abortion Act is not really about taxpayer funding. It's about government interfering with private health care decisions. It is not about protecting the innocent. It is about creating appalling, even life-threatening situations for women. It is a tax increase of historic proportions. Finally, if passed, it would eliminate the private market for abortion insurance coverage. The chief sponsor of this legislation, the gentleman from New Jersey, Mr. Smith, has been very clear about his purpose. When he introduced this bill, he cited a study by the Guttmacher Institute that showed a decline in the rate of abortions of approximately 25% when funding is cut off. What that proves, if it proves anything, is that economic coercion works. And the remarks we've just heard from the chairman make crystal clear that the unashamed purpose of this bill is to use economic coercion to prevent women and families from exercising their constitutional rights to make a choice of abortion, even with their own funds. It is an unprecedented attack on women, on families, on their rights under the Constitution, and for that matter, on the private insurance market. Let's not pretend this bill has anything to do with government funding. It does not. I yield back the balance of my time.